Dawn seeps in quietly over the sandy dunes and the ragged palisade of the fledgling Roanoke settlement, casting long gold-touched shadows across the narrow footpaths that wind between timber houses and garden plots. On this morning in late summer, 1587, the colony stirs with a restless but hopeful energy. A woman kneels by a shallow trench at the edge of the clearing, her hands gently pressing moist earth around the base of young maize plants, her brow fretted with the effort to coax a harvest from unfamiliar soil. Beside her, a small boy toddles after a wooden doll, its faded paint chipped from salt air and play. Near the central well, a cluster of men labor together, scraping rough-hewn planks and fitting them into the frame of a smokehouse, their voices carrying notes of Northumberland, London, and Somerset, mingling with the distant call of gulls. John White, the colony's governor, pauses at the threshold of a half-finished cottage, sketchbook open in his hands, intent on recording both the faces of his compatriots and the peculiar shape of a local sycamore. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth is thick in the air, mingled with the underlying tang of brine from Roanoke Sound. Nearby, Eleanor Dare, White's daughter, smooths a linen swaddling cloth over her infant, Virginia, her gaze flicking from the child's face to the blue line of trees beyond the settlement, alert for the return of friendly CROATOAN emissaries or the sign of deer on the move. Chickens peck in the trampled mud, oblivious to the wary glances exchanged between men posted as sentries atop the palisade, watching for any movement among the pines. The houses, simple wattle and daub constructions, bear the marks of rushed labor and scant resources, their walls patched with moss, their roofs still missing thatch in places. Yet there is a sense of routine and fragile optimism, a hope that the small beams germinating in the loam will yield enough food, that alliances with local tribes will hold, that the ships bringing supplies and news from England will soon round the point. For now, the colony breathes in the humid morning, each settler bound to the moment by tasks both mundane and vital, their dreams and anxieties woven into the rhythm of a new day on an uncertain shore. By midsummer of 1587, the Roanoke colonists found themselves beset by a growing sense of unease, their fragile enclave on the edge of the New World pressed by forces both seen and unseen. The palisade that surrounded their settlement, hastily erected from the trunks of local trees, their bark still rough beneath the hands of those who fashioned them, offered scant reassurance against the unknown that lay beyond. Each morning, as the sun filtered through the dense canopy, survivors of that perilous journey across the Atlantic set about their routines, tending to meager plots of corn and beans, fetching water from nearby streams, and patching the daub and wattle dwellings that had become their only shelter from the elements. But every footstep was shadowed by anxiety. The colonists' numbers, already diminished by disease and privation, were further strained by mounting tension with the Algonquian-speaking peoples whose land they now occupied. At the edge of the forest, wary eyes sometimes glimpsed movement, perhaps a lone deer, but just as likely a scout, observing their activities from the brush. Relations once hopeful and marked by cautious trade had begun to sour in the wake of misunderstandings and on both sides growing mistrust. Food stores dwindled as efforts to fish or hunt yielded less and less, the men returning from the woods with empty hands and faces set hard as flint. Even the act of drawing water became perilous, for the streams themselves seemed haunted by the memory of earlier violence. Stories circulated among the settlers of men who had vanished within the trees, never to return. Governor John White, acutely aware of the mounting danger, convened small nightly councils within the largest house, its walls flickering with the uncertain light of tallow candles. He listened to accounts of foraging parties harried by unseen adversaries, of strange marks found carved into tree trunks near the settlement's border. Every creak of the palisade, every howl of the wind beyond, seemed to suggest the approach of something inevitable. As the oppressive heat of the summer days gave way to sultry, insect-laden nights, the colony's sense of isolation deepened. The ocean, glittering just beyond the dunes, now seemed less a promise of escape than a barrier to salvation, its tides bringing only the bitter reminder that England and all their former lives lay impossibly far away. As they crowded together in their makeshift homes, the Roanoke colonists could not help but feel the weight of invisible pressure gathering around them, a force as real and relentless as the storms that battered their palisade walls. Dawn broke slowly over the patchwork of crude wooden cottages and palisade walls on Roanoke Island, casting smoky light through the gaps between roughly hewn clapboards. Inside the homes, colonists awoke on simple straw-filled mattresses, rubbing their eyes to the chill of the morning and the musty scent of damp earth rising through the cracks in the split log floors. Eleanor Adair, her infant Virginia swaddled at her side, listened to the distant murmur of men gathering outside, their boots crunching on oyster shells scattered across the muddy lanes. The interior walls of the cottages were bare, but for a few battered chests containing treasured tools and letters from home, their contents guarded jealously from the ever-present coastal humidity. In the heart of the settlement, Thomas Stevens carefully coaxed the embers of last night's fire to life, kneeling beside a clay hearth and feeding it with kindling gathered from the ragged pines on the edge of the woods. He moved methodically, his hands roughened from days spent felling trees and patching the stockade walls, his movements deliberate but weary. Through open doorways, the faint smell of salted fish drifted, mingling with the pungency of boiled beans and the tang of smoke. In the makeshift main hall, little more than a communal shelter, John White conferred in hushed tones with a handful of men, their faces shadowed by concern. Maps and battered journals lay open on the rough-hewn table between them, a quill poised above a half-written letter destined for England. Children darted barefoot along the narrow paths, their laughter subdued, dodging puddles left by the previous night's rain, and weaving between barrels of rainwater and makeshift racks hung with drying venison. Nearby, Eleanor White knelt beside the low wooden wall, whispering a prayer as she pressed her palm to the coarse planks, searching for a sense of safety in their precarious fortifications. The entire village pulsed with the low hum of daily routines, yet every action, whether the mending of fishing nets, the careful portioning of dwindling stores, or the anxious glances cast toward the untamed woods, betrayed a mounting unease. Beyond the walls, the vast unknown pressed close, and within, the colonists clung to the fragile comforts of home, mindful of each other's presence in these enclosed, uncertain spaces. On an oppressively humid day in late August 1587, the Roanoke settlement pulsed with a tense, uncertain energy. The crude wooden palisade, hastily reinforced with pine logs and oyster shells, stood as a fragile boundary against the dense forest pressing against its walls. Inside, the colonists, men, women, and children, moved about their routines with growing unease. Supplies brought from England were dwindling. The last of the salted pork had been rationed, and the cornfields planted near the sand dunes had yielded little in the stony, unfamiliar soil. John White, the governor of the colony, gathered a small council beneath a canvas awning patched with sailcloth, each face drawn and shadowed by fatigue. The question they debated was no longer whether to seek aid, but who would make the perilous journey. As evening fell, the smell of smoke from cook fires mingled with the briny air, and mothers whispered fears as they tucked their children into makeshift bedding fashioned from seagrass and old ship blankets. The air was thick with mosquitoes and apprehension. White, clutching the carved wooden stick that served as his staff, surveyed the assembled families and made his decision. He would return to England for relief, leaving behind his daughter, Eleanor Adair, her infant Virginia, and every soul dependent on a promise that help would return. The next morning, the colonists gathered at the edge of Roanoke Island's shallows, watching as White prepared to depart. His small boat, piled with what little provisions could be spared, bobbed on the gray-green water. Voices rose in thin hope and brittle farewells as the oars churned through the tide, pulling White away from the groves of live oaks and the distant cries of gulls. The moment his boat disappeared beyond the slanting line of pines, a heavy silence settled over the colony. a collective recognition that for better or worse, their fates would now unfold without the certainty of outside rescue. That day the colony crossed an invisible threshold. The action set in motion from that moment forward could not be undone, and the settlement's slender hold on survival would depend solely on decisions made within its own fragile barricades. Under the dappled shade of the ancient oaks on Roanoke Island, the air carries the faint trace of footsteps and whispered hopes, echoes of the men, women, and children who vanished without a trace in the late 16th century. In the weeks and months following Governor John White's heart-wrenching discovery of the deserted palisade in 1590, the few artifacts left behind, scattered English tools rusted in the briny air, a single chest broken open and rifled through, and the desperate carving of CROATOAN into a weathered post, became touchstones for a story that would live on in the minds of all who heard it. Local Algonquian communities, whose villages encircled the silent English outpost, carried their own memories of uneasy meetings, shared seeds, and awkward feasts, passing tales among generations of pale-skinned strangers who vanished as suddenly as they appeared. For English colonists along the coast in later decades, the Roanoke story simmered in every fireside warning, whispered among tobacco planters who cleared tangled ground, among soldiers who watched the tree lines for signs of fleeting shadows, and among children who played at discovery along the sandy beaches. In the offices of London, ink-stained fingers turned over John White's letters and sketches, trying to puzzle out the fate of the lost colony. Did they join their native neighbors, or did hunger and disease claim them in the silent forests? Each version of the tale was fueled by physical traces, a single European copper ring found many years later in a CROATOAN midden, the outline of old earthworks barely visible through summer weeds, the occasional report from fur traders of gray-eyed children living inland. Even Queen Elizabeth herself, so invested in the outcome of her namesake colony, paced the halls of Whitehall, awaiting word that never came, the story growing with each retelling and each unanswered letter. The story of Roanoke became part of the living landscape, woven into the wind that rustled through abandoned gardens, the hesitant steps of new settlers arriving at Jamestown years later, and the enduring, uneasy alliance and suspicion between English and Algonquian peoples. What was left behind was not just broken tools or half-remembered names, but a living memory, a riddle scrawled into the wood of a gate, and the sense that every clearing in the pines could be a stage for hope and disappearance.